She thought the whispers and sneers about her worn-out shoes were the worst part of the night. The way everyone laughed, the way they pointed, the way their eyes lingered on her feet as if she had committed a crime. She thought she could endure that, but then he appeared. The Tycoon. The man whose name made every room shift, whose presence bent conversations into silence. His gaze didn't scan the room, didn't glance at the chandeliers or the champagne flutes. It landed on her shoes. "Who gave you these?" he asked, voice low but sharp enough to slice through the murmurs. The laughter died instantly. Heads turned, eyes widened, every mockery, every whispered judgment froze mid-air. Her chest tightened. Those shoes weren't just shoes, they were history, memory, inheritance. And now, under his scrutiny, they carried a weight she hadn't yet understood. For the first time, she realized, she wasn't being judged. She was being found. Carmen noticed the shift the moment she crossed the threshold of Le Bernardin. The lighting was soft but exact, a golden glow engineered to flatter anyone already accustomed to belonging. Polished glass caught glimmers of movement. Silver reflected movement like liquid mercury. She tried to let the beauty steady her, to let it wrap around the fragile hope she carried. But then she looked down, and everything fractured. Her shoes were wrong. Not just mismatched or outdated, wrong in a way that felt like an exposed secret. The worn leather carried deep creases softened by years of footsteps, small scuffs along the edges, faint discolorations that no polish could erase. Against the immaculate floor, they looked almost timid, like uninvited guests unsure of where to stand. Carmen straightened her back instinctively, hoping posture alone could shield what memory had worn thin. Everything above her ankles almost worked. Her black dress, carefully rented and steamed the night before, fell smoothly along her figure. The makeup she practiced twice in the bathroom mirror held its ground. Her hair, slicked into a low bun with barely enough gel, held the illusion of neat confidence. But the shoes dissolved that illusion in an instant. No matter how composed she appeared, the leather at her feet whispered truths she had tried to leave behind. The murmurs began almost imperceptibly, shifts in tone rather than actual words. Carmen scanned the room, pretending to take in the art on the walls, the architectural curves, the elegance of textures. But her peripheral vision caught something sharper, subtle glances dropping downward, lingering for half a second too long. Then came the first laugh, quiet, private, stifled, but directed, not at her face, at her feet. A woman in a crimson gown performed the cruelty with expertise. First, she let her eyes brush over Carmen's dress, nodding slightly as if approving the effort. Then her gaze dipped, slow and deliberate, stopping on the shoes with a spark of recognition. Recognition not of fashion, but of vulnerability. She leaned toward her companion, shared something behind the rim of her glass, and a small ripple of amusement followed. It was enough to tip the room. Carmen felt her breath constrict. She tried to walk, hoping movement would distract them, but each step betrayed her with a faint creak of old leather. The sound was barely audible, yet she flinched at it, as though the floor itself announced her presence with too much honesty. Her fingers tightened around her clutch as if the pressure could anchor her. Every instinct told her to shrink inward, yet something stubborn kept her upright. At the bar, she tried to blend into the rhythm of people ordering cocktails and wine. The bartender offered a polite smile, handed her sparkling water, and moved on. But behind her, laughter rose again, accompanied by the unmistakable rustle of a phone being shown around. The angle of the camera was low, aimed toward shoes, toward the floor, toward something that didn't belong in this curated world. Carmen pretended not to notice. She lifted the glass, letting the cold condensation gather against her palm, grounding her in something real. But her reflection in the mirror behind the bar betrayed the truth. People were looking. Not directly, but in those sideways, testing glances that people used when judging without admitting it. The humiliation spread slowly, like a bruise forming beneath the skin. She drifted away from the bar, seeking a quieter place. Near a tall column, half hidden by a grand arrangement of lilies and pale roses, she found a sliver of shadow. It wasn't isolation, but it softened the exposure. From there, she watched the crowd swirl with expensive ease. The room seemed to pulse with a language she didn't speak, one built on inherited confidence rather than words. Her thoughts spiraled back to the morning. She remembered opening the small wooden box where the shoes rested. They hadn't been chosen for beauty. They had been chosen because they mattered. They carried her grandmother's journey across a border, her mother's insistence that memory mattered, her own need to hold on to something grounding while stepping into a place as unfamiliar as this. Yet here, the meaning of the shoes dissolved beneath the weight of polished floors and curated glances. She ran her thumb along the beveled edge of her clutch, trying to steady the tremor beneath her ribs. The memories pressed against her. Dusty roads, her mother's voice, the sound of distant warnings. Those shoes had walked miles of fear and hope. Now they stood on a floor so shiny they reflected sorrow back at her. The contrast twisted something tender inside her, filling her with both shame and a strange, defiant grief. Across the room, someone pointed discreetly in her direction. Carmen didn't see their face, only the faint gesture, the way a woman's eyebrow lifted in response. Another ripple of laughter followed, muted but sharp enough to puncture. Carmen's stomach folded in on itself. She rested her shoulder more firmly against the column, as though the cool stone might absorb the tension knotted beneath her skin. A waiter approached with a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres. His expression was neutral, practiced, but when Carmen reached for a spoon, a group nearby chuckled under their breath. She froze mid-motion. Heat bloomed across her neck. Setting the spoon back felt like a capitulation, but holding it felt worse. Like a test she had already failed. She withdrew her hand slowly, letting silence settle around the moment. The waiter's eyes flickered once toward her shoes, then away quickly, as if embarrassed for noticing. Carmen almost wished he hadn't. Neutrality felt kinder than recognition. She swallowed hard, feeling the pressure gather in her chest like a trapped breath she couldn't release. She had come here to honor an accomplishment, a small acknowledgement of her work. Instead, she had become the evening's quiet entertainment. Her phone vibrated in her clutch. She checked it, hoping for distraction. A message from her cousin appeared. "Send photos, I bet you look amazing in there." Carmen hesitated, thumb hovering over the keyboard. She considered a shoulder-up selfie, avoiding the shoes, avoiding the truth. But the idea exhausted her. She typed back vaguely, then locked the phone, unable to lie without feeling something inside her shift uncomfortably. She lifted her gaze again, trying to meet the room on equal footing, but the imbalance was too stark. The guests glided through the restaurant like they owned gravity itself, confident their presence enriched the space. Carmen, meanwhile, felt like she was navigating a stage where she had forgotten her lines. Every glance, every whisper felt amplified, as if the walls themselves judged her. Still, beneath the humiliation, something steadier began to stir. Not confidence, not anger, but a quiet resolve. Her grandmother hadn't crossed a border for Carmen to collapse under a few cruel smiles. Her mother hadn't told her those stories for them to unravel at the sight of champagne glasses. The shoes held more truth than any of these people would ever understand, and maybe that mattered more than blending in. But the room didn't care about resolve. A new wave of whispers spread from the entrance, softer than the first, but far more unified. The change was subtle at first, conversations pausing mid-sentence, a waiter slowing his stride, heads turning as if pulled by an invisible thread. Carmen sensed the shift before she fully registered it. Something was changing. The ecosystem of power inside the restaurant was rearranging. The lighting seemed different, not brighter but more focused, as though the air itself recalibrated. A couple near the bar straightened instinctively. Someone lowered their drink. It was the kind of silence that appeared only when someone important stepped into the room, someone whose presence bent the atmosphere without needing to speak. Carmen followed the collective gaze, though she couldn't yet see the source. A group near the main walkway parted, not dramatically, but with enough reverence to signal significance. The crowd's posture shifted, shoulders lifted, chins tightened, breaths quieted. Carmen observed it all with a strange detachment, as if watching a tide pull inward before a colossal wave. Her heart quickened without permission. She had felt invisible until now. Suddenly, it felt unsafe to be seen. She pressed her palm lightly against the column behind her, steadying herself. Her breath hitched as the room's attention narrowed to a single point. She couldn't see who everyone was looking at, but she felt the ripple of recognition move like an undercurrent. A name she didn't yet know seemed to hover in the stillness, shaping the gravity of the room. She leaned slightly to the side, trying to catch a glimpse. All she could make out were shifting silhouettes and the glint of dark fabric. The murmurs softened further, becoming almost reverent. The crowd's focus tightened like a camera lens adjusting toward clarity. Carmen sensed that whoever had arrived didn't just belong here. They defined the hierarchy of the space itself. Her pulse thudded against her ribs. She didn't know why fear and anticipation blended inside her, why her skin prickled as if a storm were gathering just behind her. But something inside her whispered that this arrival wasn't accidental, that some invisible line was about to cross hers. The shoes, the glances, the humiliation. None of it felt random anymore. Then the tightening of the crowd shifted direction, toward her. Not fully, not obviously, but enough. People were turning not just to see the newcomer, but to see where his gaze had landed. Carmen inhaled sharply, feeling the truth before she knew it. Whatever force had entered the room was not moving past her. It was moving toward her. Carmen hadn't seen his face yet, but she already understood one thing with absolute certainty. The man everyone revered had come into the room looking for something, and his attention was closing in on her. Carmen felt the shift before she saw him, an almost electric tightening of the air as if the room itself had inhaled. People unconsciously stepped aside, creating a quiet corridor through the crowd. She pressed harder against the column, unsure whether she wanted to disappear into it or brace herself. Her breath caught as footsteps approached, slow and unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to being noticed without effort. She tried not to look. Looking would confirm something she wasn't ready to face, but her eyes betrayed her, lifting despite her instincts. Over the heads of the crowd she caught the first impression. Tall dark suit tailored with a precision so sharp it might have been sculpted directly onto him. Not flashy, not ostentatious, just unmistakably deliberate. Power expressed through restraint, the way the truly dangerous carried themselves. His presence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The space around him reacted as though pulled into orbit. Conversations fell silent mid-sentence, glasses lowered, posture straightened. Even the soft music playing under everything felt quieter, as if sound itself made room. Carmen sensed that this wasn't the kind of man people admired. It was the kind they measured themselves against, hoping not to be found wanting. She tried to swallow but couldn't. Her throat felt too tight, her chest too rigid. The humiliation from earlier still burned inside her, but now it tangled with something far more unsettling. A sharp, instinctive awareness that she had become a point of interest in a room where she had tried to be invisible. She didn't understand why he was looking toward her. She only knew she couldn't run from it. He stepped fully into view. Dark, slightly graying hair at the temples. A jawline drawn with ruthless precision. Eyes sharp enough to cut through the soft glow of candlelight. There was something restrained in his expression. A quiet force held beneath the surface like deep water pretending to be still. Carmen didn't know him. Yet some part of her recognized the danger in being seen by a man like that. People greeted him as he moved. Subtle nods, light touches to his arm, murmurs of respect. He acknowledged each one with minimal movement, never fully stopping. His attention skimmed over every face, every pair of eyes seeking favor, until it stopped abruptly, on her. Carmen didn't see the moment it happened. She only felt it, like a spotlight flicking on without warning. Her stomach dropped. She stood frozen, hands tight around her clutch. She didn't understand the look on his face. Not shock, not curiosity, but something closer to recognition flickering just under the surface. His gaze dropped, just slightly, toward her shoes. The breath left her body. She felt exposed in a way that humiliation alone could not explain, as if he were seeing something in them she had never considered. Carmen instinctively stepped back, but the column behind her stopped her movement. The cold marble pressed into her spine, anchoring her in place. She felt small under his scrutiny, but not the same smallness inflicted by the others. This was different, like he was measuring distance between past and present, searching for something she didn't understand. And the room noticed. Every eye began following his. Someone whispered his name nearby. She didn't catch it, Just the reverent tone, the way it wrapped around the syllables. People adjusted their posture, angling themselves to appear more composed, more relevant. Carmen could feel the ripple spreading outward as guests wondered why he had deviated from his usual path, why his attention had landed on the woman partially hidden behind a column. She wished desperately for the crowd to look away, for the moment to dissolve into nothing. Instead, the attention sharpened. The woman in the red dress stared openly now, her lips parted in disbelief. The men beside her tracked the Tycoon's every movement, brows raised, unspoken questions forming. Carmen's shame deepened but intertwined with something else, fear that she couldn't quite name. He continued forward, each step slow, deliberate, unhurried. Carmen's pulse quickened, the rhythm of someone preparing for impact. She didn't know what she was supposed to do, move, greet him, pretend she didn't see him approaching. Her body refused to obey any command her mind gave it. All she could do was breathe shallowly and watch him close the distance. She thought of slipping away sideways, vanishing behind the floral arrangement, but his gaze locked her in place. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even stern. It was simply final, an unspoken acknowledgement that the moment had already chosen her. Her knees felt weak. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she might faint. She gripped the clutch tighter, feeling the faint ache of pressure in her fingers. When he reached a respectful distance close enough to speak, far enough to offer space, he paused. The subtle murmur of anticipation from the crowd thickened around them. Carmen forced herself to meet his eyes, if only to prove she hadn't completely collapsed into fear. His gaze held hers quietly, almost gently, but with a gravity that made her chest constrict. He didn't look at her dress, her hair, or the cheap clutch in her hands. He didn't scan her for any of the tells that people often use to categorize strangers. Instead, he lowered his gaze again, intentionally, precisely, toward the shoes. Carmen felt the blood drain from her face. Someone in the crowd exhaled audibly, the sound slicing through the quiet. A part of Carmen braced for the ridicule she had endured all evening, the smirk, the whisper, the condescending comment about appearances. But his expression didn't shift into mockery. It darkened instead, subtle and controlled, as if something inside him tightened. His jaw flexed once, a barely perceptible movement, but one that vibrated with meaning she couldn't decipher. He lifted his gaze back to her, slower this time, with a question forming before it ever reached his lips. Carmen felt an impossible urge to step away, to put distance between herself and whatever memory he was drawing upon. But the moment held her still, suspended between fear and an inexplicable pull she didn't understand. The room around them was no longer mocking, only watching. Guests slid closer without moving their feet, leaning in through silence. Carmen's humiliation blended into a sharper vulnerability. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She didn't want her shoes, the last intimate piece of her grandmother she possessed, to become spectacle, mystery, or curiosity. Her breath trembled as he stepped half a foot closer. She could smell his cologne, subtle, restrained, something woody and clean. It grounded her as much as it unsettled her. His eyes softened, only slightly, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that cut through every remaining murmur in the room. But he didn't finish the question yet. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if gathering something invisible between them. Carmen felt her pulse hammer against the delicate skin of her throat. She sensed everyone waiting for his words, waiting to understand why the most powerful man in the room had crossed to her corner. Her shoes suddenly felt unbearably heavy, as though the weight of their story pressed down through the soles and into the floor, as though the past they carried was rising to the surface without her permission. She stared at them, then at him, desperate to understand what he saw. His lips parted slightly, breath steady, eyes fixed on hers with unnerving clarity. Carmen tried to inhale, but her chest resisted. The moment stretched, taut and trembling, as though sealed in glass. She could feel the question coming before he spoke it, a shape forming in the charged space between them. Her heart slammed once, hard enough to sting. The humiliation of earlier shrank beneath a deeper fear, the fear that this stranger, this Tycoon, recognized something she did not. Something hidden inside the very shoes everyone else had ridiculed. Something she had never prepared to confront. And then, in a voice low enough that it felt meant only for her, he finally spoke. "Where did you get those shoes?" The question wasn't cruel. It was something far more dangerous. Carmen froze, because the way he asked it didn't sound like curiosity. It sounded like recognition. For a moment, Carmen wondered if she had misheard him. The room had gone so quiet that even the ambient music seemed to retreat into the corners, leaving only the soft hum of breath and anticipation. His question vibrated through her chest, like a muted strike. She stared at him, unable to move, the words repeating in her mind with a weight she didn't understand. Recognition. Why recognition? She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her tongue felt heavy, her throat tighter than before. He watched her, not impatiently, but with a deep, unsettling stillness that suggested he expected the answer to matter. The crowd held its collective breath behind him, a wall of eyes waiting for a drama they couldn't name but desperately wanted to claim. Carmen's shame, earlier so sharp, now dulled beneath confusion. She tried again, voice cracking. She lowered her gaze to the shoes as if seeking guidance from them. The leather looked darker under the lights, the creases deeper, the worn edges sharper. They suddenly resembled something far older than she had ever considered, almost like relics rather than remnants. When she lifted her eyes back to his, he was still staring at them, not at her. Her fingers trembled around her clutch. She had told this story before, to cousins, to her sister, to herself. It was the one part of her family's history she carried without embarrassment. But the way he asked changed everything. She didn't hear mockery or judgment. She heard something else, something that sounded like memory trying to surface. She swallowed and forced her voice steady. "They were my grandmothers," she said quietly. The words barely carried past her own breath, but he heard them. His shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening, as though a thread inside him pulled taut. He lowered his gaze again, studying the shoes with an intensity that unsettled her. Carmen felt a strange urge to cover them, to shield them from whatever he was searching for. The guests closest to them exchanged glances, their curiosity sharpening. Carmen saw the woman in red lean forward slightly, trying to catch the next exchanges. A man behind her took a small step closer, glass held near his chest, pretending to sip while clearly eavesdropping. The room, so bright a moment ago, felt narrower, more intimate, as though the walls were inching in to listen. He looked up again. "Your grandmother," he repeated, not questioning but testing the shape of the words. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried with an authority that made every nearby breath hold still. Carmen nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. His eyes softened, barely, but the shift was enough to change the temperature of the space around them. "What was her name?" he asked. The question landed differently. Not invasive, not casual, deliberate. Carmen's pulse quickened. People didn't ask about her family in places like this. They asked where she worked, where she studied, what she planned next. But her grandmother? That belonged to another world entirely. She wet her lips, searching for balance. "Lucia," she whispered. Saying it aloud felt like opening a door she hadn't expected to find here. The name carried warmth, hardship, courage. Her grandmother had spoken softly, moved quietly, lived through storms without letting them hollow her. Carmen waited for him to nod politely, to offer some empty acknowledgement. Instead, he inhaled sharply through his nose, almost as if the name struck him. He didn't disguise the reaction. His jaw tightened, the tendons briefly visible beneath the skin. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concentration, like a man trying to recall a memory buried under decades. Carmen felt her breath stumble. The room felt suddenly colder around her ankles. Something about the way he stood shifted, the poise of a man accustomed to control giving way to something sharper, more personal. "You're sure?" he asked. The question was soft but charged. Carmen blinked at him, startled. "Of course," she said. Her voice carried more confidence this time, but beneath it lay confusion. Why would anyone doubt her grandmother's name? He exhaled slowly, gaze drifting a fraction to the side as though bracing himself. She sensed he wasn't questioning her. He was questioning something inside himself. He studied her face more carefully now, not in admiration or critique, but in search, a recognition that unsettled her. His attention moved between her features as if mapping familiar lines, searching for echoes. Carmen froze beneath the scrutiny, wanting to step back but too anchored by the intensity of his gaze. The room seemed to dim around the edges, the crowd fading into peripheral blur. "She wore shoes like these?" he asked finally, voice quiet but weighted. Carmen nodded again. She crossed the border in them. The sentence fell out more abruptly than she intended, carrying a truth she rarely spoke aloud in rooms built for luxury. Whispering it here felt almost sacrilegious, as if she had brought something raw and honest into a space allergic to both. His expression changed yet again, this time more visibly. The lines around his eyes tightened. His breath hitched, not dramatically, but enough for Carmen to notice. The hand he had kept loosely at his side curled slightly, fingers brushing against his palm. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. Not weakness, not surprise. Something deeper. Something akin to recognition mixed with disbelief. He leaned in, just an inch, lowering his voice further. "Where did she get them?" The question wasn't simple. It carried a gravity that felt far too heavy for the pair of shoes at her feet. Carmen hesitated, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She had never asked her grandmother where they came from. She had only absorbed the story as a child. These were the shoes worn during her crossing. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "I never asked." The admission seemed to strike him harder than she expected. His eyes darkened with something like regret, or perhaps something older, tied to a past she had no access to. He looked down once more, the line of his jaw tightening again, as though fighting a thought he didn't want to finish. The silence between them grew taut. Carmen felt every second stretch, drawn thin like the surface of glass. The crowd around them barely moved, but she sensed their anticipation building, feeding off each pause. Her skin prickled beneath the weight of it. She didn't know what story he was piecing together, but she could feel herself caught in its center. He stepped closer, a deliberate, measured step that brought him within arm's reach. Carmen inhaled sharply, the proximity startling. His presence radiated heat despite the restraint in his posture. He lowered his head just slightly, eyes never leaving hers. "She must have gotten them from someone," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. Carmen's breath shook. "Probably," she whispered, but she never said who. She realized how thin her voice sounded, how fragile against the weight of his. He studied her for a long moment, absorbing every nuance of her expression. The room around them might as well have vanished. It felt like standing inside a quiet storm, the kind that gathers strength without making sound. People began inching closer again, unable to resist the pull of the moment. Carmen heard a soft rustle of fabric, a whispered, "Do you think he knows her?" from someone behind a cluster of guests. She stiffened, throat tightening. This was not attention she sought. She wanted to disappear, to fold into the column again and escape the spotlight that had been forced onto her, but he didn't let her retreat. Not physically, he hadn't touched her, but in gaze, in presence, in sheer gravitational force. "Lucia," he repeated under his breath, as though testing the memory against reality. Carmen felt a shudder move through her, part fear, part curiosity, all anchored in the sense that her grandmother's name meant something to him. Then his eyes dropped again, slow, precise to her shoes. This time when he looked at them, his expression fractured, only slightly, but enough. Something like recognition, something like loss, something like a memory resurfacing after being buried too long. Carmen's breath caught. She felt the world tighten around them, a ring closing inward. He straightened slowly, eyes meeting hers with a clarity she couldn't read. "Those shoes," he said quietly, "are not supposed to exist anymore." The sentence punched the air around her. Carmen's knees weakened. A jolt of cold fear slid down her spine. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, but in understanding, the kind that begins at the edges and creeps inward. Her voice came out barely audible. "Why?" she whispered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence close around them again, assessing her with eyes that seemed to see far more than she ever intended to reveal. Then, with a breath that trembled almost imperceptibly, he lowered his voice further. "Because I know who made them." Carmen froze, and for the first time all night she realized the danger had never been the mockery. It was the history she'd been wearing without knowing it. For a long, suspended moment, Carmen couldn't decide whether to breathe or brace herself. The words "I know who made them" echoed inside her like a struck bell, vibrating through confusion and fear. She felt suddenly exposed. Not because of the crowd, not because of her shoes, but because something intimate and unspoken had been pulled into the open by a stranger who seemed too certain of what he'd seen. He didn't press further. Instead, he studied her with a stillness that felt heavier than silence. His expression wasn't triumphant or satisfied. It carried something more complicated, as though he were recognizing a ghost he'd never expected to meet again. Carmen's fingers tightened on her clutch, her pulse fluttering with a nervous beat she couldn't control. She swallowed, trying to find balance inside the swirl of tension. "You knew her?" she whispered. The question escaped before she fully formed it. His jaw shifted, but he didn't answer immediately. He looked past her shoulder as though the memory he was searching for hovered somewhere beyond the room. The crowd remained hushed, their interest sharpened by each quiet second. Carmen felt the weight of their stares but couldn't look away from the man in front of her. "Not personally," he said finally. His tone was careful, as though every word required deliberation. "But I knew the man who made those shoes." His gaze lowered again, not with curiosity but recognition tinged with something closer to regret. "I would have recognized his work anywhere." Carmen felt a chill ripple through her. The leather no longer seemed merely worn. It felt marked, as if carrying a signature only he could see. She forced her breath steady. "Who was he?" she asked. He hesitated. An actual hesitation, not a performance. His eyes shifted downward, then lifted with a mixture of restraint and something almost protective. A man who didn't survive long enough to see where his work ended up. The quiet gravity in his voice struck her. People around them exchanged glances, their fascination deepening, but Carmen felt the moment narrowing only to the two of them. Her grandmother's face flashed through her mind. A soft expression, a tired smile, lines shaped by weather and worry. Carmen had never imagined those shoes carried a story beyond her family's memory. The idea that someone else had touched them, crafted them, risked something for them unsettled her. She felt as though a door she didn't know existed had creaked open, revealing shadows she wasn't prepared to see. He lowered his voice further, not to conceal meaning from the crowd, but to respect the weight of it. He wasn't supposed to make them, he said. Not for her, not for anyone in her situation. Carmen felt her breath catch. Why not? But he exhaled slowly, eyes flickering with conflict, as though torn between honesty and caution. This wasn't a man used to being unsure. Seeing it now unnerved her. He crossed a line, he murmured. One that cost him more than he expected. The words hung between them. Carmen sensed the story pressed against his expression, straining to surface, yet held back by something unspoken. A tension built inside her. Not fear this time, but a strange, rising dread that whatever truth hid behind these shoes was far larger than she imagined. She shifted her weight lightly, almost imperceptibly. The movement seemed to pull him back into the present. He blinked, jaw tightening again. His attention sharpened, returning fully to her. "What did your grandmother tell you?" he asked. Carmen hesitated. Only that she wore them when she crossed. He absorbed the answer quietly, but something flickered across his face, an acknowledgement mixed with sorrow. He stepped half a pace closer, voice lowering enough that the crowd strained invisibly to hear. "She didn't tell you who protected her along the way, did she?" Carmen's heart stuttered. "No," he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then she shielded you from more than hardship." His words, gentler now, unsettled her more than the stares around them. She felt the past tightening like a thread across her chest. Someone in the crowd dropped a fork. The metallic clatter rang sharply before fading. The break in silence startled Carmen, but the man didn't flinch. His attention had tunneled entirely on her as though nothing else existed. "Those shoes aren't just old," he said softly. "They were paid for with a risk your grandmother may never have understood. Or chose not to remember." Carmen swallowed hard. Her thoughts fought to assemble meaning, but the pieces didn't fit. "Why do you care?" she asked. The question came out more vulnerable than intended. He didn't react with offense or surprise. Instead, he drew a slow breath, his expression shifting into something unexpectedly human, less polished, less untouchable. "Because the man who made them was my friend," he said quietly. And he died for helping someone he never met. Carmen's lungs tightened. The room seemed to shrink again, the air heavier and closer. "My grandmother?" she whispered. He didn't answer directly, but the silence served as confirmation. A wave of dizziness washed through her, but she stayed still, compelled by the gravity in his eyes. "You're sure?" she asked. He nodded once. "I watched him craft that pair. I remember the stitching, the leather, the shape. He made them for her." The crowd's energy shifted subtly, curiosity folding into awe. Carmen barely heard them. Her thoughts tangled with emotions that felt too large to sort. Grief for a man she'd never known, gratitude she couldn't express, fear of what this revelation implied. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. He met her gaze with measured weight. "Because some people are willing to lose everything for one act of decency." Carmen's chest tightened until her breath shook. She felt the floor under her shoes more vividly now, as if the history he spoke of pressed upward through the worn soles. Her grandmother had walked miles in silence. Carmen had inherited only fragments of the story. But this man, this stranger, held pieces her family had never revealed. "How do you know all this?" she asked. He exhaled through his nose, slow and restrained. "Because I was there when he broke the rule," he said. "I saw him slip them to a woman who wasn't supposed to receive help. I warned him. He ignored me." Carmen felt her heartbeat accelerate. The past she thought she knew had shifted under her feet. "What rule?" she whispered. But he shook his head slightly. "Not here," he murmured. "Not in front of an audience." Carmen glanced around. The crowd was pretending politeness, but every tilt of their shoulders betrayed their intentions. They wanted the story. They wanted the tension. They wanted to see where the scene would break. Carmen felt faintly nauseous. These shoes, her grandmother's pathway to safety, were not entertainment. He saw the tension in her posture and softened his stance, lowering his shoulders. His voice gentled. "I didn't mean to put you on display." Carmen almost believed him. But the room, the attention, the pressure, it was too much. Her breath trembled, her eyes stinging with a sudden rush she tried desperately to swallow back. She didn't want to cry under so many eyes. He stepped slightly to the side, blocking part of the crowd's view with his body. The gesture was subtle, but it shifted her breathing. No one had shielded her all night, not once. She blinked rapidly, steadying herself. When she finally met his gaze again, his expression held something she couldn't name, a blend of understanding, regret, and protective focus. "I can tell you everything," he said quietly. "But not here." Carmen felt her heartbeat pulse in her palms. Something about the invitation frightened her. Not because it felt dangerous, but because it felt deeply, irrevocably connected to a story she had unknowingly carried into this room. "Where?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He hesitated just a beat, then stepped closer. "Somewhere your grandmother would have chosen," he said. The answer chilled her in a way she couldn't define. She sensed he wasn't speaking metaphorically. Carmen steadied her voice. "And where is that?" He held her gaze for a long, weighted moment before answering. "A place where the truth cost more than either of us can repay." Carmen's breath halted. Before she could respond, he turned slightly, just enough for her to sense something else behind him. Something or someone who had been listening far too closely. Carmen felt the shift before she saw who stood behind him. A faint tremor moved through the crowd, small, nervous, instinctive. People straightened. Conversation seized in place, and a subtle stream of glances cut toward the far side of the room. The Tycoon's posture changed, not defensively, but with the alertness of someone who had just sensed a threat he recognized. Carmen's breath caught as she followed the direction of his focus. A man stood several steps behind him, half shielded by guests who were pretending not to watch him. He was tall, sharply dressed, and carried a tension that vibrated through the space around him. His gaze didn't wander. It fixed directly on the Tycoon and Carmen with a precision that felt surgical. Carmen couldn't read his expression, but the atmosphere around him tightened like fabric stretched too far. The Tycoon shifted subtly, angling his body between Carmen and the watchful stranger. It wasn't overt protection, more like instinct, something reflexive that said he didn't want her exposed to the attention now converging. His voice dropped slightly, carrying a note that hadn't been there before. "We should go," he murmured. Carmen nodded but didn't move. Her legs felt locked, Rooted by disbelief and rising unease, the stranger stepped forward. His walk was measured, too deliberate to be casual. Carmen sensed something familiar in the way others reacted, respect tinged with discomfort. Like this was a man people preferred not to cross paths with. He paused only a few feet away. His eyes moved from the Tycoon to Carmen, lingering on her shoes a moment too long. The air tightened again. "So it's true," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a cold undertone. The Tycoon didn't answer. His jaw clenched, just once, before settling into rigid calm. Carmen watched the tension between them thicken. The stranger glanced at the crowd, impatient with their attention, then back at the shoes. "You found a pair," he said softly. "After all these years." The Tycoon stepped closer to Carmen, not touching her, but establishing a clear boundary. "Not here," he said, voice steady but hardening. "You know that." The stranger's expression twitched, annoyed but restrained. "I thought they were destroyed," he murmured. "Every last one." He tilted his head toward Carmen. "And yet, here they are. She brought them. Here." Carmen's pulse hammered. The stranger's fixation unsettled her more than the crowd's earlier ridicule. This wasn't ridicule. This was a tension with history behind it. She forced her voice to steady. "They were my grandmother's," she said. The stranger's gaze snapped to her, sharp enough to make her flinch. His eyes thinned slightly, analyzing her face as if searching for proof beneath her skin. The Tycoon stepped in. "Enough." The word wasn't loud, but it carried authority that made the stranger still. A flicker of tension passed between them. Something unspoken, heavy, shared. Carmen realized in that moment they weren't strangers at all. They knew each other. And whatever tied them together was not simple, not benign, and not finished. The stranger exhaled, irritation coiling through the breath. "You always interfere," he said quietly. Even now, his gaze cut back to the shoes again, lingering with a darkness that unsettled Carmen. "He died for this," he murmured. "For them, for her." His attention returned to Carmen. "Do you have any idea what you're wearing, or what it cost?" Carmen's chest tightened. She stepped back instinctively, but the column stopped her again. Her voice came out faint, almost fragile. "I only know they were hers." The stranger's expression twisted, part incredulous, part pitying, part bitter. "Of course she never told you," he said. "Why would she? These shoes carried a story no one wanted to remember." The Tycoon's voice sharpened. "Stop." His tone was controlled but edged with warning. "If you want to talk, not here." The stranger held his gaze for a long, charged moment. Then, without the slightest shift in tone, he asked, "Does she know who wore them before her grandmother?" Carmen felt her breath freeze. The Tycoon's eyes hardened, jaw locking. "That's enough," he repeated. This time there was no softness. Carmen's heart pounded. She looked between them, confusion building into fear. "Who wore them?" she asked. The room felt too quiet. The stranger looked at her with a hint of something she couldn't name. Sadness, perhaps, or reluctant respect. "Someone who never made it across," he said. The words struck her like cold water. She swayed slightly, gripping the clutch to steady herself. "What do you mean?" she whispered. The Tycoon shot the stranger a warning look, but the man ignored it. "Those shoes weren't made for your grandmother. They were meant for someone else, someone whose crossing failed." Carmen felt a faint ache build behind her ribs. Her thoughts scrambled. "Then, how did my grandmother—" The stranger interrupted gently. "She survived because someone else didn't." Carmen felt the room tilt. Her breath came shallow and too fast. The Tycoon placed a subtle hand near her elbow, not touching but ready should she falter. The gesture grounded her, even as the truth stabbed deeper. She struggled to find footing in a narrative she had never known existed. The shoes had always been symbols of survival, of strength, of family resilience. She had never imagined they were born from loss. She lifted her gaze to the Tycoon. "Tell me the rest," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't. The Tycoon hesitated. The stranger watched with unreadable intensity. Carmen felt heat rise in her cheeks, fear, grief, confusion mingling. "I deserve to know," she whispered. The Tycoon exhaled, quiet and steady. "You do," he said. He looked at the stranger again, But not here. The stranger didn't argue this time. He stepped back, expression tightening. He glanced around the room, uneasy with the number of ears leaning toward them. Then he looked back at Carmen one last time. The truth isn't gentle, he said, and it's not finished. He paused, voice lowering. Whatever you think those shoes mean, it's more. Carmen swallowed hard, throat burning. She felt both smaller and heavier in the same moment. The Tycoon nodded once, relieved at the stranger's retreat. But Carmen sensed tension still coiled in him. Like this confrontation had reopened old wounds he wasn't ready to face. He turned to her, expression softening. Come with me, he murmured. Somewhere quieter. Carmen nodded slowly, her legs trembling, her mind a storm of unanswered questions. The crowd parted as they moved, whispering urgently. Carmen felt every step pulse through the soles of her shoes now, as though each creased line carried a voice she had never known how to hear. Her grandmother had walked miles in them. Someone before her had never finished their path, and now Carmen was being led toward a truth that waited in the next room. They reached a small, dim hallway near the back of the restaurant. The noise of the crowd softened behind them. Carmen exhaled shakily, trying to steady herself. The Tycoon paused, studying her as if trying to gauge how much she could bear. She met his eyes. Tell me, she whispered. All of it. He inhaled slowly, the weight of memory pressing visibly across his expression. But before he could speak, a voice echoed from the hallway behind them, a voice that knew her grandmother's name. Carmen turned sharply toward the voice. It carried a tone she had never heard before. Low, deliberate, threaded with recognition that didn't belong to this place. A woman stood at the end of the dim corridor, half lit by the spill of warm light from the dining room. Her hair was neatly pinned, her blouse immaculate, but her eyes told a different story, something tired, heavy, and disturbingly familiar. The Tycoon tensed as soon as he saw her, not with hostility, but with the weary readiness of someone who knew this moment had been waiting to surface. His posture shifted subtly, a quiet shield forming between Carmen and the newcomer. But the woman didn't seem intimidated. Her gaze remained fixed on Carmen, almost reverent, as though seeing someone long imagined but never encountered. I knew it, the woman breathed. The moment you stepped into the room, Carmen felt unease twist in her stomach. She had never seen this woman before, yet the way she looked at her suggested something intimate, something anchored deep in memory rather than chance. Carmen took a step closer to the Tycoon, not out of dependence but instinct, grounding herself in the only steady presence she understood. Who are you? Carmen asked, managing to keep her voice from breaking. The woman approached slowly, each step measured. She didn't look at the Tycoon. She didn't acknowledge the tension in the air. Her attention locked solely on Carmen, as if the years between them were dissolving. My name doesn't matter, she said quietly. What matters is that I knew your grandmother long before she crossed. The hallway felt narrower with every word. Carmen's pulse raced. You knew her? She whispered. The woman nodded, emotion flickering across her face, not sentimental but mournful. She wasn't supposed to make it, the woman murmured. None of them were, but she carried something other people died protecting. Her eyes dropped to Carmen's shoes. Slow, heavy, filled with meaning Carmen couldn't grasp quickly enough. The Tycoon exhaled sharply, caution threading through the sound. Not here, he warned, but the woman ignored him. She deserves the truth, the woman replied, her tone firm yet fragile. And you've kept it locked away long enough. Carmen looked between them, realizing with a jolt that they knew each other, not as acquaintances but as people tied to the same buried history. The woman's expression softened when she met Carmen's eyes again. Your grandmother? She wasn't just crossing for herself. She carried someone else's burden. Someone who didn't survive to carry it. Carmen felt her breath falter. Whose burden? She asked, voice barely audible. The woman hesitated, as though the answer required more strength than she had left. Finally, she whispered, a friend. Someone deeply connected to the man who made those shoes. The corridor seemed to contract. Carmen felt the floor shift beneath her, not literally, but in meaning, in the sudden tilt of everything she believed she knew. The Tycoon closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing for impact. When he opened them again, they were darker, resigned. Carmen understood then. He already knew what the woman was about to reveal. He made them for his sister. The woman said softly. Carmen's heart lurched. Sister? The woman nodded. A girl barely 18, she tried crossing first. He crafted those shoes for her, thinking they'd protect her on the journey. But she never reached the border. Soldiers caught her group. The woman swallowed, voice quivering despite her composure. She died before she could take 3 steps into the desert. Silence sank through the hallway like cold water. Carmen stared at the shoes, feeling the weight of a story she had walked on for years without knowing it. The Tycoon's gaze dropped as well, his jaw tightening at a memory he couldn't erase. Your grandmother arrived days later, the woman continued. He recognized her desperation. He gave her his sister's shoes, told her to run, and she did. Carmen felt tears burn at the edges of her vision. Her grandmother had never spoken of another girl, never mentioned a man who sacrificed his own blood so she could live, never shared the anguish behind the souls she entrusted to her granddaughter. Carmen pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself, the cold surface grounding the shock pulsing through her. And you? Carmen whispered, turning to the woman. Where do you fit in? The woman's eyes softened with something like regret. I was one of the volunteers who documented the crossings. I saw him hand her the shoes. I saw the way she looked at him, fear mixed with disbelief. I promised him I'd watch for his sister's return. Her breath shuddered. She never came back. The Tycoon stepped forward slightly, his voice edged with quiet warning. You shouldn't be saying this here. The woman lifted her chin. You shouldn't have stayed silent for so long. He didn't fire back. His shoulders lowered, defeated. Carmen realized the truth was a burden he had carried alone, and the woman's words were prying it open after years of restraint. Carmen swallowed hard, the pressure behind her ribs tightening. Why didn't my grandmother tell anyone? She asked. The woman offered a small, tragic smile. Guilt, she said softly. Survivor's guilt. Many who crossed silently carried others' stories. It wasn't uncommon. But hers was heavier than most. She stepped into a life meant for someone else. The hallway trembled with invisible weight. Carmen looked again at the Tycoon, searching his expression for clarity, for blame, for anything she could anchor herself to. Instead, she found sorrow. Not pity. Sorrow. The kind that belonged to someone who had lived through the same storm her grandmother had survived. You were there, Carmen whispered. His eyes lifted slowly. He nodded once. The woman continued, her voice gentler now. The man who made those shoes. He was your grandmother's only ally in those final hours before she crossed. He gave her everything he had left. Carmen felt her stomach tighten. And your friend? She asked, looking at the Tycoon. He inhaled deeply, voice steady but frayed around the edges. He was my closest companion. My brother in all but name. The revelation hit Carmen like a blow. He died protecting her path? She murmured. The Tycoon's gaze darkened, grief flickering across his face with controlled restraint. He died because he believed one life was worth risking his own. Carmen closed her eyes briefly, feeling the shoes grow unbearably heavy beneath her. Memories she had inherited unknowingly pressed upward, reshaping themselves with each truth revealed. When Carmen opened her eyes again, the hallway felt thinner, almost fragile. The woman stepped closer, voice softening further. Your grandmother survived because someone chose her over blood, and she knew it. She carried that weight her entire life. Carmen's throat tightened. She had never imagined her grandmother bore such a burden, never imagined the kindness and tragedy bound to the shoes she kept so carefully. The Tycoon's voice lowered. Those shoes were supposed to stay in the desert, he said quietly, buried with the rest. When I saw them tonight, I thought my friend's last act had vanished decades ago. But there they were. Carmen shook her head slightly, overwhelmed. I wore them because they were hers. She whispered, I didn't know any of this. The woman nodded. You weren't meant to. Some stories survive only to protect the next generation. But tonight, they resurfaced. Carmen's breath trembled. She looked down again at the creased leather, no longer simply old, no longer simply worn. They were the last breaths of a stranger's life, preserved beneath her steps like an echo waiting to be heard. What do I do now? She whispered. The Tycoon hesitated. The woman looked away, uncertain. That's not for us to choose, she said softly. But you deserve to understand what you're carrying. Carmen nodded slowly, grief and gratitude mixing inside her. The shoes no longer felt like inheritance. They felt like responsibility. The Tycoon's voice finally softened. "We can tell you everything," he murmured, "but not in fragments. Not like this." Carmen felt a tremor of fear, but also resolve. She nodded again, more firmly this time. The woman stepped back, letting the Tycoon guide the moment. Carmen felt her breath begin to steady, but before either of them could continue, footsteps echoed from deeper in the hallway. Fast, purposeful, unmistakably familiar. Someone else had arrived, and Carmen felt immediately that this person wasn't coming to reveal the past, but to claim it. The footsteps grew louder, sharp and confident, cutting through the hush of the hallway as if slicing open the thin veil of fragile truths hanging between them. Carmen felt the vibration of each step echo through her shoes, stirring something uneasy inside her chest. The Tycoon straightened immediately, a reflex of long-ingrained caution. The woman who knew her grandmother stiffened, shoulders tightening with a tension that warned Carmen to brace herself. Then he appeared, a younger man, perhaps mid-30s, sharply dressed, composed in a way that suggested he was used to navigating corridors of power. His expression was unreadable at first, calm, almost aloof, but when his eyes landed on Carmen, something shifted, a flash of recognition that didn't belong to her, but to the story she had unknowingly stepped into tonight. He slowed, gaze dropping to her shoes before rising again, heavier now. The Tycoon's posture darkened, controlled but unmistakable. "Not now," he said quietly. The younger man's jaw tightened, as if emotion fought beneath restraint. "You didn't tell me she was here," he replied. His tone wasn't hostile, just wounded, perplexed, carrying an undercurrent of something unresolved. Carmen sensed instantly that his presence wasn't an intrusion. It was an inevitability. He stepped closer, enough for Carmen to feel a quiet force radiating from him, a mix of anger, grief, and fierce longing. "May I?" he asked, nodding faintly toward her shoes. Carmen swallowed, caught between uncertainty and the gravity of the moment. Slowly she nodded. He crouched slightly, studying the leather without touching it, eyes narrowing with recognition so strong it bruised the air around them. "I knew these," he murmured. The words struck Carmen like a gust of cold wind. He rose again, blinking hard. When he met her gaze, there was a rawness he didn't attempt to hide. "My father made them." His voice wavered. Not weakness, but the tremor of someone opening an old wound. Carmen's breath collapsed inward. She felt the world tilt in quiet disbelief. The Tycoon stepped closer to the younger man, his expression softening. "I tried to tell you," he said. The younger man shook his head once, not in denial, but in the fragile way someone does when reality finally catches up to a long-avoided truth. "You said the shoes were gone," he replied. "Destroyed. Buried. You said there was nothing left?" The Tycoon's gaze drifted to the floor. "I believe that." The woman in the hallway released a quiet exhale, as if she'd been waiting for this moment far longer than any of them realized. "Your father's work survived," she said gently, "even if only through her grandmother." The younger man's jaw trembled. He looked at Carmen with a mixture of awe and pain, emotions weaving through each other with no clear boundaries. "She wore them," he whispered. "She carried them all her life." Carmen's voice barely held together. "I didn't know," she said. "She never told me?" The younger man nodded, swallowing hard. "She didn't tell anyone," he said quietly, "because my father died helping her, and she never forgave herself for surviving." The truth, heavy, layered, unmerciful, settled over Carmen's shoulders like a shroud. She felt suddenly older, shaped by a history she had never asked to inherit. The woman stepped back, allowing space for the grief settling between them. "He didn't regret saving her," she said softly. "Not for one moment." The younger man inhaled, steadying himself. "I know," he whispered. "It just took me years to understand why." Carmen watched the two men share a glance, one mourning a friend, the other mourning a father, bridged by the shoes at her feet. Carmen looked down at them again. The creases, the worn seams, the softened leather. They no longer felt like humble heirlooms. They felt like testimonies of courage and tragedy. imprinted with lives intertwined by both chance and sacrifice. She felt her grandmother's presence more vividly than ever, a woman who had carried silent burdens to protect those she loved. She finally spoke, voice soft but unwavering. "What do you want me to do with them?" The question wasn't simple. It carried the weight of legacy, the uncertainty of ownership, the fragile balance between honoring the past and moving forward. The younger man looked at the Tycoon, then back at Carmen. "What you choose," he said. "They're yours now. Not because she gave them to you, but because you walk with the same courage." The Tycoon nodded slowly, his tone gentled by something almost paternal. "You carry her strength," he said, "and his sacrifice. Whatever you do from here, let it be with awareness." Carmen felt a deep, trembling ache settle behind her ribs. Grief for her grandmother, sorrow for the man who died, and a quiet but growing understanding that she was now part of a story much larger than her. A hush settled over the hallway, not heavy, but reverent. Carmen lifted her chin slightly, meeting each of their gazes. "I won't hide them," she said. "Not anymore. And I won't be ashamed of where I came from." The Tycoon's expression softened with faint, restrained pride. The younger man blinked rapidly, emotion cracking through his composure. The woman stepped forward and touched Carmen's hand lightly, a gesture without intrusion, full of recognition and respect. "Your grandmother would be proud," she murmured. Carmen closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth rise in her chest, anchoring her to the moment rather than the fear that had started her night. When she opened them, she felt steadier, grounded, changed. The Tycoon studied her with the calm solemnity of someone witnessing a transformation he hadn't expected but deeply respected. "There's more to tell," he said quietly. "But not tonight. You deserve time to breathe." Carmen nodded. For once, she didn't feel overwhelmed by the unknown. She felt ready to face it. The younger man stepped back, wiping at the corner of his eye discreetly. "If you ever want to know more about him," he said gently, "I can tell you everything I remember." Carmen's throat tightened. "I'd like that," she whispered. He nodded once, firm and sincere, before stepping away into the dim corridor, giving her space. The woman excused herself next, offering a final look of respect before disappearing down the hall. Carmen remained with the Tycoon, the world suddenly quieter without the restless weight of eyes and whispers. She inhaled deeply, feeling the air fill spaces inside her she hadn't noticed were empty. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't respond right away, but the gentle shift in his gaze said enough. "Walk with me a moment," he said. The words weren't a command, merely an offering. Carmen nodded, stepping beside him. Her shoes, once sources of humiliation, now felt grounding, powerful, sacred beneath her feet. She walked with newfound steadiness, each step echoing lineage, sacrifice, and inherited courage. They emerged from the hallway back into the restaurant's glow. The crowd quieted as she passed, but their judgment no longer pierced her. She felt untouchable, not because the room respected her, but because she respected herself. The Tycoon kept a respectful distance, but the air between them held an unspoken acknowledgement of everything they now shared. At the entrance, he paused. "Whatever happens next," he said, "you're not alone in it." Carmen met his eyes, finding sincerity without pretense. She nodded once, a small gesture carrying gratitude deeper than words. Then she stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin, carrying the faintest scent of possibility. She looked down at her shoes one last time, creased, weathered, beautiful in their history, and felt her grandmother's courage steady her. Carmen inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the night, then stepped forward with quiet resolve, because for the first time in her life she wasn't walking in someone else's survival. She was walking into her own beginning.